Good evening and welcome to Talk With. My name is Kamwata Mayondi, and on tonight's episode of Talk With, we are talking about climate change and its impact, and we're talking with the Zambia Climate Change Network. In studio with me tonight is Mr. Patrick Kabanda and Lydia Chibambo, who represents the ZCCN, and we'll be talking about climate change and its impact. Good evening and welcome to Talk With.
Good evening.
Yes, I'm very happy to have you on the show. So getting into a bit of a background with where Zambia is. So the Zambian economy is predominantly focused on the exploitation of our natural resources. We have mining as well as agriculture, and Zambia's climate is highly variable, and over the past few decades we have experienced a series of climatic extremes including droughts, seasonal floods, flash floods, extreme temperatures, and dry spells. And the climate of Zambia, including its precipitation and temperature patterns, is expected to continue to change in the next 5 to 40 years. In the absence of the adaptation to disaster risk management, this could highly affect agriculture, health, as well as the energy sector. So, Patrick, when it comes to understanding climate change, which is described pretty much as the Earth's climate changing due to human activities, and then over the long term resulting in a disruption of weather patterns. Is this an accurate definition of the term?
No, definitely. When you are talking about climate change, you cannot run away from understanding what weather is in the first place. So first of all, you'd understand that weather is simply the day-to-day
atmospheric
conditions.
I remember that from school, yes.
Yeah, definitely. So it's day-to-day atmospheric conditions, but when you're talking about climate change, you're talking about the average changes over a long period of time, that is 30 years or more. So the difference there is with climate change, you're looking at a prolonged period of time where you are analyzing the day-to-day weather pattern changes. And after they accumulate over a long period of time, then now you understand the climate change in itself.
Right.
Yeah.
So we've understood, first you start with weather, then you look at it over a long period of time. Like in this particular, in our opening, we talked about 5 to 40 years where we'll be seeing different changes happening in weather patterns. But why do people still dispel the fact that climate change is happening? So there are some naysayers who say, no, nothing is happening. Why is that?
Well, others are saying climate change does not exist. Others are saying it's hearsay, just like you have stated, and we have seen this debate in most of the scientific communities. And the reason is because the argument is that the Earth has been naturally changing over a period of time. So they are not attaching the current changes to human activity. They are saying it's just normal.
It's a cycle.
It's a cycle. The Earth does this almost over a long period of time anyway. But scientific evidence shows us that the rate at which temperature is the temperature is rising, or the temperature is increasing, or the rate at which the Earth is warming up has been accelerated over the few years. And in fact, in the last 5 years, they have been described as the hottest or the warmest years in centuries. So that has been attached to the fact that climate is changing because of human activities. And it's basically because of the emission of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So there is a debate. It's two-sided. Others are saying it's not true. Others are saying it does exist.
So what does ZCCN say? Does it exist?
I can never overemphasize this more. Climate change is real, and it is mostly because of the emission of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere attached to human activities. So the concept is that there is climate change basically because of one reason. The Earth is heating up. And why is the Earth heating up? The Earth is heating up because of the accumulation of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, causing global warming.
Right. So, so when it comes to the conversation around climate change, there are a lot of buzzwords. Climate change, we have global warming, you're talking about greenhouse effect and that type of thing. So just help us understand these buzzwords. And is climate change different from global warming?
All right. I think let me define global warming first. Global warming is simply the retention of solar energy, which is made possible by the ability of greenhouse gases to absorb outgoing radiation and, if possible, to re-radiate it back to Earth. So what we are simply saying is that global warming is simply the Earth is heating up. And why is the Earth heating up? Because we have we have been emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere that have acted as an umbrella or a blanket, blocking some of the radiation from leaving the Earth. Yes.
Right.
So the fact that some of the radiation is not leaving the Earth is what is causing the Earth to heat up, and hence the terminology global warming.
Right.
The Earth is heating up, and there is warming, basically.
Right. So we definitely have seen changes here in Zambia with regard to the way that the weather patterns have been. And sometimes you wake up to jokes of people saying, what's this June in July? And you have people saying today it's feeling very, very hot and that type of thing. So going back to what's happening for us here in Zambia, in early or around late March, we saw really, really shocking floods in Wapula province where about 1,500 people were displaced from their homes. So climate change is definitely real, and we're seeing some certain strange things happening around our environment. And when it comes to that, what are the impacts? What do we expect to see in Zambia as effects of climate change? We have just given an example of the floods that happened in Wapula this year.
Oh, yes. When it comes to climate change effects, I think Zambia has not been spared. We've been seeing a lot of impacts around us, just like you have stated. The floods are one of them. I think Zambia is vulnerable, and one of the vulnerable sectors is simply land use activities.
Right.
Yeah, we had a drought in the southern half of the country just in the 2017-2018 farming season. And this year, the World Food Program was already distributing food and certain food aid. Emergency cash transfers were taking place in southern province and other parts of the country. So already it's telling you that the impacts are real and there is a problem. And if this problem is not addressed, then you are going to experience some of the shocks that have been stated in most of our documents.
Right.
One, you are talking about hunger. You are talking about water shortages, the dying of animals, the extinction of certain species. So the evidence is right before us. It's there for us to see.
Right. So I like that you bring it to say that the consequences of us not paying attention to what's going on around us results in problems with food security. We've talked about crops failing to grow. We'll have animals dying. So it will definitely affect our food production. So when it comes to a country like Zambia, where we are so dependent, for example, on agriculture and that type of thing, what do we need to do in order for us to make sure that we have food security?
That's a very good question. When it comes to food security, there are a lot of interventions that have been put across, and a lot of projects countrywide are running on sustainable agriculture and how we are able to produce our food in a more efficient and sustainable manner. So we can say the sustainable farming is one of the interventions where you are ensuring that your agriculture is not totally dependent on rainfall. It's not rain-fed agriculture. You try to bring in some irrigation, and you also ensure that you are using methods that are in harmony with nature, agroecological methods.
Right. I like that you talk about harmony with nature. So what type of interventions are actually happening, those that are in harmony with nature?
Currently,
right,
there are a lot of projects in the country, like I mentioned. There are different organizations pursuing different agendas. Okay, and if you look at our national, our NAPAs, National Adaptation Programs of Action, already they are spearheading or giving you just an example of what the government is doing so far and how they are responding to the different sectors with respect to climate change. There are a lot of institutions and organizations in Zambia that have different projects and spearheading different agendas.
Right.
Yeah.
So getting now back to your organization, the ZCCN, what exactly is your main focus? Because when it comes to climate change, in my understanding, it's quite broad. Certain people will focus on whether it's making sure that agriculture is more sustainable, or if they're going to see how technology can help with making us more green. So what exactly does ZCCN focus on?
For ZCCN, we are mostly in lobbying and advocacy, all right? So we are trying to sound the trumpet, all right, and also create awareness on climate change itself, climate change impacts, climate change effects. So we are in the lobbying and advocacy business, if I can put it that way. Yeah, and we have partnered with a lot of other institutions in ensuring that our lobbying and advocacy is evidence-based. So when we go to Parliament and we are called to present on different things, we are ensuring that we are bringing the evidence on the table. So we are partnering with a lot of other entities, and we have a lot of members under our umbrella.
Right.
Yeah, academic institutions, we have faith-based organizations, we have community-based organizations, and just individuals.
So I like that you're part of the lobbying and the policy, because a lot of it comes down to what our current policies that we have in place and how do they impact what's actually happening on the ground. So when you're coming from a policy perspective, how then could we, for example, as Zambia, we are in mining, we're in agriculture, that type of thing. So we have a lot of foreign-owned mines operating here in Zambia. So at a policy level, how can Africa, I think it's probably an Africa-wide problem, how do they leverage good business with also environmental protection? So from a lobbying point of view.
Okay, I think right now we do have the national policy on climate change that practically gives direction on how we go about the climate change scenario in our country, which institution is responsible for what, and etc. So it's more like a Bible, a guiding principle.
Could you just give a bit of a summary of what exactly, where we are as a nation with regard to our policy on climate?
On climate?
Yes.
That's interesting because last month, we were looking, is it this month? Yeah, I think this month. We were looking at we were making our input into the scope of the climate change bill. So we do have a climate change, the national policy on climate change, and the Ministry of Lands and Natural Resources, especially under the climate change department, is trying to put up the climate change bill, and ZCCN was called upon to have input into the scope of the climate change bill. So there has been good progress, especially to the national frameworks with respect to climate change. The government has done quite well with respect to policies and with respect to frameworks and instruments that can give guidance or direction on how climate change is supposed to be tackled in different ministries and sectors of government.
Right. Which brings me to my next question. When you have a country like Zambia, we have so many challenges. We have poverty, we have corruption, we have a lot of challenges. Do we then, and currently world over, we're looking at COVID-19. How do we rank our needs with regard to climate action and lobbying? Because on one hand, you could have some people say, okay, yes, it's getting hotter, but we still have this really huge problem of the number of girls who are getting married too early and then losing out on a chance to be educated. Or for example, we're looking at infant mortality and that type of thing. So how do we rank our needs as a country without leaving any one thing behind?
Wow, that's a very tricky question, but it all comes down to priorities. What are our priorities? First of all, we should look at the SONA speech, the speech by the head of state that he gave to the National Assembly, where he mentioned climate change 44 times in his speech, and mentioned how it's the major enemy currently to the growth of this country economically, and he pointed out quite a number of challenges. And for such a speech, or for the head of state to mention climate change 44 times, it just shows you how serious climate change is, and how government puts climate change as number one on most of the on addressing some of these challenges that we are facing. Although quite disappointingly, the national budget or national allocation to environmental protection and climate change activities is quite disappointing.
Extremely.
Yeah, so for us, we're just saying it's just a matter of priorities. Where are we placing our priorities? And it's not only a matter of placing priorities, it's also a matter of acting. Right. Is your action towards addressing the challenges that you're pointing out to? So for Zambia Climate Change Network, I think we are there to give the checks and the balances and to point a government in the right direction. We give them kudos if they do a good thing, and we rebuke them if they do the wrong things.
So what recent activities have you had that have provided checks and balances to the government? Is there anything you could bring out for us? No,
definitely. There are quite a lot of things. We were called to Parliament. We gave input into the expanded budget committee, looking at the budget allocation and if the budget allocation really does address climate change issues. So we went to Parliament to give that directive, to give our voice, the civil society voice. And also the Committee on Agriculture, Lands and Natural Resources were often called also to give our input into the different situations or challenges related to climate change in the country. And also just carrying out lobbying and awareness activities. Currently, we are working on a project with WWF, where we are about to carry out awareness raising with members of Parliament. Unfortunately, because of the COVID-19 issues, Parliament session has been suspended. So we had a little bit of a drawback. But I think by next month, this month actually, yeah, we should be making progress towards that. So there are quite a number of awareness-raising initiatives and activities, climate ambassadors, issues of sustainable mining, efficient energy, and etc. There are quite many. But what we are focusing on currently is giving that policy direction and ensuring that everybody understands what climate change is and they are aware of the impacts of climate change.
Right. So if you've just joined us here with me, Kamota Mayondi, and this evening we are talking with ZCCN, which is the Zambia Climate Change Network, and we're speaking to Mr. Patrick Kabanda, and we go to a break, and after this we'll be joined by his colleague Lydia, and we'll get further into the discussion to see further if there are any winners and losers when it comes to climate change conversations, and what do growing cities mean with regard to the way that the climate change is affecting us. So stay tuned, we'll be back after the break. Welcome back. You are watching Talk With, and tonight on Talk With, we talk with the Zambia Climate Change Network, and I'm speaking now with Lydia Chibambo, and welcome to the show.
Thank
So
you.
we've had a very interesting conversation with your colleagues so far, and just picking up where we left off, we've definitely talked about where we are with regard to policy and the work that ZCCN is doing with regard to lobbying and making sure that we have our leaders acting in line with what is best for the climate. So picking up from where we left, when it comes to business and government, how do we get businesses and governments to support clean energy? Because sometimes it almost feels as though there's a bit of a trade-off between these things. So how do we make sure we're all aligned?
Okay, all right. Thanks, and that's quite a very good question in terms when it comes to energy, as well as when we look at issues of climate change. So when we look at issues of energy, it's one of the major contributing factors to climate change effects for this country. As a country, we are dependent on forests for cooking. Mostly that's firewood and charcoal. Like 70% of the Zambian population depends on charcoal, yes. So that now gives us a way huge kind of a challenge in terms of when we speak of energy. And these have kind of the triple effects when it comes to energy, because now we have we've had issues of water resources.
We have load shedding.
For me, I don't call it even like an energy crisis. That's a water crisis because of droughts and all that.
Right.
So that now has made most of the people now to get now to the issues of using charcoal for cooking. So you cannot depend on electricity because you won't have electricity.
And
throughout.
gas is quite a luxury.
And
the average Zambian
can't afford the gases. So this now gives us more in terms of what kind of alternatives should we be looking at. And as ZCCN, one of our advocacy issues that we've also been focusing on is people should now get to more cleaner kind of cooking or efficient cooking.
Right.
So for us, in terms of coal, now we have a lot of coal mining, which we know one of the mining is contributing to the national grid of electricity. But for us, that is an issue because coal really emits a lot of carbon in the atmosphere.
Right.
So we have so far 3 mines that are in Sinazongwe that are producing coal.
Right.
And for us, that is quite an issue because in as much as that is kind of a way of contributing to the energy deficit, but
still,
again, it's adding
it's
to
it's countering the positive.
So for us, those are the issues. We should be thinking of other alternative ways that we could go to. We know at times maybe really drifting away from charcoal might take a bit of a time. So why shouldn't we now get to some kind of energy efficiency? I think we've seen some of those braziers or stoves that have a lining, a clay lining, that kind of like stores a bit of energy. So those are some of the technologies that we should be looking at.
Right.
So in terms of the private sector, the business sectors, I think our role as ZCCN is also to make sure that these business entities, just apart from them contributing to these technologies and having a solution, but businesses also should look at what kind of technology are they promoting. Is it a technology that is going to help out communities out there, or are we still getting round to the same cycles where we're still emitting a lot of carbon in the atmosphere? So
so creating green jobs.
That is what we're looking at. So as a network for the past from last year, we've been working with a project which is known as the African Coalition for Sustainable Energy and Access. So where we're looking at people really getting off to more sustainable practices. So we took off the solar energy. I think that is more cleaner, and I think as a country, we're kind of blessed with a bit of solar energy. So those are some of the technologies that we should be going to. Because, when you go around now with load shading, you'll be amazed that especially business entities are more depending on the generators that are using diesel.
Right.
So those also are contributing to the carbon
emissions.
So we're kind of like still getting it like more like the triple effects. So we need more and more interventions, especially even the population out there to understand that some of these, in as much as we have an alternative to the current situation, the problem that it's not the best.
So Lydia, would you then say it comes down to a pricing factor? Because there's one thing where it's I don't know that what I'm doing is wrong, but on the other hand, they're like, okay, this is there, but I can only afford to burn charcoal. I can't afford to have a solar panel outside my hut or outside my flat. So how do we make it? How do we make sure that alternative methods are also friendly with regard to cost?
Oh yes. So these are some of the issues that we bring on board as a network in terms of how do we make these alternative sources more affordable for the locals. So you agree with me that indeed it's quite costly for an ordinary person maybe to use alternative like the solar. We know solar it's quite costly, okay? But then these are issues now in terms of how do we engage policies, in terms of how do we look at some of the taxes that probably we kind of look at.
So incentivizing
them, yes, and also shifting in terms of could we go more into our own manufacturing of some of these things that we could produce as a country, so that we run away from that cost and still kind of depend on our own sources, which will be kind of affordable. So I think it's quite, we really need to engage more and more in terms of starting with the policies, the business themselves, even the communities also to know in terms of the general population to know what kind of technologies should we go to. So we really need to get into this.
Do we currently have any incentives around any industries to make people opt for greener options? I know we do pay the older that your car is, you'll have to pay more with regard to how much it's emitting on the road. With regard to carbon, but do we have any other industries that are incentivized or have a bit of a penalty slapped for how much they're polluting?
Okay, as a country, I think that's when we're trying to develop models in terms of what kind of model that we use in terms of that. But I know in terms of project-wise, yes, we have some projects. Currently, we have the ZFuel project, that the integrated forest land use that is in Eastern Province, that is working around with communities in terms of looking at how much forest they are saving, and then in giving out in terms of incentives to these communities for conservation,
okay.
yes, purposes. And I know we have the Bulb Carbon Partners, that it's a project running in Rufunsa, that also have kind of a model where they are incentivizing the local communities. So currently, as a nation, I know there is one project running for Lusaka that they're trying to look at in terms of the transport sector, in terms of how do we make sure we are more on a greener path.
Because Lydia, I was getting worried because I'm like, everything is in the rural, but I think the big cities, they're the biggest culprits. In the same way, on a global scale, larger economies are polluting more, but if anything happens, it's the poorer developing nations who would struggle the most.
Absolutely.
So what's happening in Lusaka? You were saying something about transport.
Yes, so I know through the Lusaka City Council, they're trying now to design a model in terms of in the transport sector. How do we make sure in the transport sector we have kind of more reduced carbon emissions from this public transport that is there. And I know there's been also, I think if you've seen certain roads that, the new roads that are being constructed, they are kind of trying to put across also the cycling pathways, so that maybe we get to more cycling.
Right,
and then reduce on the
bicycle lane.
Yes, so those are some of the structures that are coming forth, and the pilot projects that are there in terms of seeing that we kind of get there. So I think even the housing now, I think people are kind of encouraged to kind of look at more climate resilience infrastructures that are there. I know one of the buildings has been constructed more looking at in terms of climate resilience. That's if you've been to the Ministry of Housing and Infrastructure.
It's a green building.
It's a green building that is kind of speaking into issues of heat. It will regulate the heat, as well as when it's cold, it kind of regulates. So if we could move more into such infrastructure-wise as a country and as cities, that will see us more speaking to
I like
this.
that it's beyond, because sometimes we think very much tunnel vision when it comes to what climate change is. It's so much more than whether you are going to buy your groceries with a disposable bag or you are using the plastics that were banned. So I think it's important to also think about it in terms of how you're moving around, the type of buildings we're living in, the type of roads we're constructing. So are there any winners and losers in a conversation around global warming and climate change? Or is everyone at par? Because of course some industries can say leverage that and maybe make good money with regard to providing solutions. But should we think about it that way, or should we just say, look, it's not a win-lose, it's we all want to win? Where are we with this?
Okay, so in terms of that, I think we all fall in the same boat, because when you look at issues of climate change, I always say, it calls for everyone to act. Because if I'm practicing the good way in terms of making sure that we we mitigate issues of climate change, and my neighbor is not doing the same, the effects will kind of cripple us all together.
Right. We're cancelling
yes.
out.
So all of us really need to get in these issues. Because talk of the floods or when we have the heat wave coming through, I think it affects all of us. It doesn't choose that, oh, this one
this one buys the disposable
plastic. This one. So it's really calls for every one of us that we should get there. And I'm glad, as my colleague mentioned, in terms of the other issue that as a network that has been lagging behind in terms of issues of climate change is the legal framework. So we are happy now that we're getting into the climate change bill and then get it through to be an act. At least in that way now you will see more of these business entities, especially the mining as well, is one of the culprits in terms of emitting a lot of carbon. So we'll see that they'll be taken to task, as well as they'll also come through in terms of also contributing to the communities in terms of corporate social responsibilities, in terms of some of the environmental practices. So we're looking really forward to having these legal frameworks that will make people more accountable to issues of climate change.
And so you've touched on development, and we know for a fact that especially if you live here in Lusaka has so much construction going on. There are malls everywhere, there are roads that are being expanded, and some people have been quite upset about the tearing down of the trees slightly before the civic center. So there's a bit of a give and take. Like, where do we draw the line between, okay, we're trying to expand the city, decongest roads, so these trees have to move. And then quite recently, there was a bit of it wasn't a bit of a scandal. There was a lot of talk in media back and forth around Forest 27. We're looking at expanding our city, but at what cost? So when it comes to climate change and growing cities and human activity, how best do we navigate this to say, okay, yes, we need a mall in this area, or no, we have a housing crisis. Let's move this area and let's convert it into, say, maybe flats or a school. So how do you then look at progress versus preservation of, whether it's water bodies or natural water. Yeah.
Yes, you're very right. So when it comes to development versus preservation or conservation of these sensitive sites, I think it becomes really an issue. And at times, as environmentalists, we've been cited at times like, we don't want development, we are anti-development. But for us, what we talk of is in terms of, could we develop more of smart cities, cities that will still speak to our issues of climate change, that will be environmentally friendly. So we don't want to have expanding cities that are going to disturb the ecosystem that we have. There's a natural way that the systems work in terms of the downflow of water and all those things. So if you disturb issues like the forest, because the forest is one of the custodians of the carbon that we're talking of, a tree will really store a lot of carbon. And then once you cut down that tree, that means you are kind of emitting a lot of carbon. And then those are the issues. So we're saying, I think as a country, for me, we have a lot of land. I don't know at times that we want really to congest ourselves in the city, in one area. And yet, as a country, I think it's quite vast. This is a country that is quite sparsely. And if we could just get into more integrated planning of our cities, where we know that the way we are developing is more in a more sustainable way, and we are taking into account all these issues. At times, I think our development also is not very kind of harnessed or kind of coordinated. There are times that I think are we
building our cities too fast or haphazardly?
We kind of building them haphazardly. There's no kind of a systematic way that we are kind of building the cities. I'll give you an example. I think most of the times you find that people would get into having these, I think we have a lot of plots that are given out without really putting across certain services that are needed in these cities or in these compounds. And then like it's a by the way thing, and then you think of, oh, now we need water. And then that's when you're rushing to the service provider to say we need water in this area, we need roads. But for me, those are the things that should be planned in a more a systematic way, and taking into consideration the environment as well. So I think as a city, as Lusaka, there are certain areas that have been developed on very sensitive ecological areas that we shouldn't have done that. And that's how come we have issues of flooding now. And then when we have those now, we're rushing to now the government saying no, Boma Ilanganepo. But in the first place, I think as an individual, these are the things that we need to look at in terms of am I developing in a more sustainable way that won't affect the next generation to come. I think as people, we should be considerate to say, we're not here to stay forever, I think, so we should...
We're custodians.
We are custodians. We are keeping it for the future generation that is coming through.
I like that you mentioned the issue of generations. So when you look at a global overview, we have youth activists like Greta Thunberg who are very vocal about the type of earth that they have inherited and what will happen to the next generation. So who is to blame, or are we past the blame game? Is it the previous generation? Is it the now generation? Or should we put blame aside and do what we need to do for Earth, for the future?
Okay. I think this one, I think we could blame ourselves like the now. I think we found a lot of these kind of sensitive areas that were still preserved, that we were able to find. And there are times that we with colleagues in our network, there are times that we say that, in future, if we're not so careful with certain practices, we'll be just drawing a tree and be able to tell that there used to be these things. And because everyone is just getting into this kind of development that they're not really getting so sensitive. So I think ourselves, we have a lot of work that we need to do. And for me, I always, when it comes to issues of the environment, I always get to the Bible, where I think just in the creation of it, just when you read Genesis, I think there we are told that we need to replenish the earth. So for me, replenishing really is to making it better than we found it. So I think that also gets through as Christians and as well as other religions as well. I think
custodianship.
Yes, custodianship. So it's us really to look at what kind of actions are we going to do now. I think for me, we still have hope. It's not too late. We still have a hope that we can still change these things. And if we start with young children, that's better. Right. So as a network, we also have programs with what we call the climate change ambassadors, where we're working with schools. We're believing we need to catch them as young, so that these practices are
ingrained in them. Right.
And
because we still have so many adults who still will throw garbage out of the window and that type of thing. So it's catch them young, it's easier.
It's easier that way.
Well, I would like to believe it's not too late for anybody to change and be better. Yes. So what type of climate education do we want to see, and what, other than just targeting very young children or youth, what other interventions are there for other demographics with regard to climate education?
Okay, so we have a lot of quite a wide kind of areas in terms of interventions. I think one of it also has been issues around our water resources as well. So we need really to safeguard both the surface water as well as the underground water, so that is something that will also help us in terms of issues of climate change. And then we are talking of also, I think it has to do a lot more with the practices as well. I think as a country, we're not doing very well. I think when we had cholera, I think people's attitudes towards environmental management had changed, but not anymore.
So do you think it's a cultural issue or it's a mindset issue?
It's really a mindset issue, because we are the same people. When we travel out there, we get to change and then kind of practice what others are doing.
Right, you're not littering the streets of London, for example, if you're visiting London.
So it's just this kind of, sometimes I don't care kind of attitude that people have in terms of, I can litter anything. Maybe someone, I when I'm moving, I kind of ask people, so when you throw that, whom are you expecting to pick that for you?
Because pollution is also an aspect of climate change. And for me, one of my biggest fears is how much plastic we have, and we don't really have recycling going on. So I also think sometimes it's not just drought, it's much wider than that.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. So all those things, and also in terms of also in the agricultural sector, I think it's one of also the areas that we're looking at in terms of what kind of practices are they using in terms of farming. Are we using a lot of chemical that is degrading our environment? And then we're going to produce food that is not sustainable. We're going to consume food that is not sustainable. So all these areas, we kind of need to look at all these issues so that together we could move forward and see that we have a very kind of environment that is clean and healthy for everybody.
And it's also important to realize that it's beyond just human beings, because we have life underwater suffering because of what we're doing here on land. And we have plastics in the oceans, and we have just so many things that are not going well because of human activity. And when it comes to where we are currently, COVID-19, we have seen the world was slowed down, economies shut down, we had certain countries locking down, and scientists reported it was as if the earth took a deep breath and was able to relax and breathe. We have noticed drops in temperatures, slightly less carbon emissions, as well as clearer skies in certain areas. So it seems unfortunate that that's almost the trade-off. But as we are adjusting to what we are calling the new normal, how can we go about opening up our economies while still supporting the earth? So how do we find some balance?
Okay, so we need just to be very kind of sensitive in terms of how are we going to open up. And I think it's kind of, the COVID-19 has really opened up opened a lot of people's eyes in terms of what are some of the practices that we could be looking at. And this is what we're saying, now we need to be kind of very kind of sensitive in terms of what kind of practices are we going to be engaged into, and what kind of maybe technologies are we going to kind of promote, so that we see to it that we are moving more in a very sustainable way, and then we don't just open up haphazardly without maybe checking this. So for me, it gives us kind of a room in terms of to plan more, in terms of how are we going to move forward now that it has given us some chance or some space, that we should now think through it in terms of how do we move forward. And on the other hand, COVID-19 has kind of brought in a lot of other issues in terms of, I know others have lost jobs, and the easiest is to get to the natural resources that are easy to go to. So I've seen a lot of, I think a lot of charcoal trading, where people have resorted more to an economic activities where they could go to cut down a tree, make charcoal, so that they could have an income. So I think this kind of space is giving us to think through in terms of what are some of the other technologies that we should be talking of, that people should be getting into, as we are now encompassed with two issues of climate change and then the pandemic. Yes. So we really need to think through as families, as communities, and as a nation, so that we look at some of these practices, we interrogate some of these practices that we are having. And for me, let's kind of like get to kind of our indigenous kind of knowledge. You know, there's certain knowledge that our forefathers could use in terms of safeguarding the environment. So probably we need now to interrogate those kind of practices that they used to have, so that together we could now kind of have more sustainable development.
Right. Thank you so much, Lydia. And on that note, we come to the end of Talk With. It's been a very, very informative conversation. And this has been Kamota Mayondi, and you are watching Talk With, and we were talking to the Zambia Climate Change Network. See you next Friday. Good night, and God bless you.